A true story of an auto salesperson in Korea. This is a story from a senior colleague of mine who worked in automotive sales. Behind short news articles, there often hides a much longer and much more unpleasant reality. The protagonist of this story is a senior who worked in automotive sales long before I did. He is now in his late 50s and runs his own business after having left the company. One day, when the senior was on duty watching the store, a middle-aged man wandered into the showroom. The man said, "My nephew is buying a car, so I've come to take a look," and chose a vehicle in the class of a Hyundai Grandeur at the time. This was about 20 years ago, so it was a bit unusual for a young man in his late 20s to choose that class of car. But as long as he said he would buy it, there was no reason to stop him. When the senior briefly explained the price and delivery time, the man said, "I have my nephew's ID and all the documents, and I can provide the deposit as well." However, the next thing he said was strange. The man wanted to use the 120% loan that existed at the time to cover not only the vehicle price, but also acquisition taxes, miscellaneous fees, and even the old loan processing fees, all to buy the car with zero money out of pocket. Since it was an era when the processing fees alone could exceed 1 million won, buying a car for 0 won, including everything, was quite a proposition. The senior said, "I'll run a credit check and get back to you," sent the man on his way, and ran a credit check under the nephew's name. The result was surprisingly good. His credit rating was high. His credit card usage history was spotless. There were no delinquencies, and he even had a record of working for over a year and a half at a workplace with the 4 major social insurance plans. There were almost no factors that would cause the loan to be rejected. The senior told him over the phone, "There are no issues with the loan, but I would like to proceed by setting a collateral mortgage, lien." Then the man persisted, saying, "It's my nephew's first car in his life, so can't we do it without a collateral mortgage?" The senior negotiated with the company's capital representative, pushed that the loan should be possible even without collateral given these conditions, and eventually managed to get it approved without a lien. The car was successfully delivered. However, less than a month later, the man returned and said, "I need another one of the same car for a different nephew." When the senior ran a credit check, this nephew was just as perfect as the last, and another car was delivered. This continued at a pace of 1 or 2 cars a month, and for about half a year, cars for his nephews kept rolling out without pause. For a salesperson, someone who brings in referrals is a key man, so the senior was happy at first. However, he also felt a strange sense of unease. He had never once seen the face of a single nephew, yet the man brought a stack of documents every time, documents that would be difficult to obtain without the nephew himself present, such as resident registration abstracts, certificates of registered seals, copies of ID cards, and copies of bank books. Still, the senior didn't want to upset the man, and since it wasn't a situation where he was personally losing money, he just kept proceeding with the deals. The senior, while initially happy, said he had some inner reservations. He had never once seen the faces of the nephews, yet the required documents were always perfectly prepared each time. From resident registration abstracts and seal certificates to copies of IDs and bank books, the man always brought them all. One day, unable to hold it in anymore, the senior asked, "Aren't there too many nephews, and aren't their surnames and ages a bit too inconsistent?" The man smiled slightly and said, "Then why don't you come over to my place today and have a meal?" Before long, the two became close enough to share meals and drinks, and the man bridged the gap by calling the senior Hyung-nim older brother and treating him like a younger brother. Then one day, the senior finally asked, "Aren't there too many nephews, and aren't their surnames and ages all over the place?" The man smiled slightly and said, "Then why don't you come over to my place today and have a meal?" and invited the senior to his home. 20 years ago, GPS navigation wasn't as commonplace as it is now, so the senior followed the man's car to find the house. A bit outside the city center, a church came into view, and right next to it stood a luxurious mansion that looked like the home of a wealthy family in a TV drama. There was no sign of anyone else when they entered. The man brought out the food himself, serving dishes like steak and sausages. As they talked over the meal, the man slowly began to share his past. He said, "I was an abandoned child, raised in an orphanage, and I built my fortune from nothing by starting a brick factory." He then added, "Now, I am giving back to children who grew up in the same environment as I did." He explained that when the children from the facility reach adulthood and enter society, he gifts each of them a car and covers a significant portion of their loan repayments. He said that when he was young, he envied people with cars so much, and he didn't want to leave those children with that same sense of deprivation. Furthermore, he mentioned that he is now deeply involved in the operation of that facility. In the next room, trophies, certificates, and photos of the children were lined up on display. It was there that the senior finally understood why the documents were so perfectly prepared and why the man was doing all the legwork on behalf of his nephews. He even felt a sense of respect for him. From then on, every time a car was delivered, the senior began paying out of his own pocket to install higher quality window tinting and GPS devices. One day, the senior stopped by the house of a shaman he was close with to take a break. The moment the shaman saw his face, she asked, "Have you been anywhere lately?" When the senior replied, "I've just been working," the shaman tilted her head and said, "You smell like something unnatural. It's close to the smell of a ghost who died away from home." She added, "Stay away from the water. Do not provoke anyone's grudge, and humble yourself enough to accept a loss. Your fate is currently teetering." She warned him in an unusually stern tone. The senior tried to brush it off as half a joke, but the shaman insisted with a stiff expression, "I am being serious. Do not take this lightly." A few days later, the man returned and asked for some time, saying, "I want to talk about a business matter." On the way, he made the senior drop off documents at a mailbox, met up near a county office, and then headed toward his brick factory. As the entrance to the factory came into view, the senior received a phone call from the shaman, who was wailing and pleading for help. "I've rolled over and I can't move. Come here right now." The senior stopped the car in front of the factory, apologized to the man, turned around, and drove like a madman to the shaman's house. However, when he arrived, the shaman was sitting there without a single scratch on her. She said, "What I said earlier wasn't a lie. Your lifeline was just severed." She scolded him. "It's as if you've died and come back to life. Where were you headed earlier?" When the senior told her he was on his way to the brick factory, the shaman's expression changed, and she said, "Contact me the next time you meet him. I need to see that man myself." About a week later, the man returned to the dealership, so the senior contacted the shaman as promised, and she waited in the parking lot. The shaman walked around like a customer, then suddenly touched the rearview mirror, pushing it in to make a jarring noise, which interrupted the business consultation. As soon as the man left, the shaman trembled and collapsed to the floor, repeating, "That is not a human. It's not even an evil spirit. It's a devil. If you get involved, you will die." The senior was more confused than anything, as he hadn't experienced any direct harm, and the business situation had been very profitable. The shaman said, "Let's go check both the house and the factory at night." When they went to the mansion first, the lights were off, and the shaman said, "There is no strong energy here." Next, they headed toward the brick factory. As they drew closer, the shaman became frantic, screaming, "Turn back! Don't go any further!" Once they finally turned back, she lit incense at her house and prayed for a long time. After her prayers, the shaman declared, "There are several grim reapers descended upon that factory, and there is a mountain of spirits who died with unresolved grudges. That place is not a factory, it is a hellhole." Even so, the man contacted him again and said, "Let's eat at my place today. Make sure you make time for it." And the senior, despite his hesitation, went along with it. Over the meal, the man proposed, "I want to expand my welfare projects overseas, so I'm letting go of the factory. I want you to be my successor. Quit the dealership and become the president." The man said, "The factory is currently idle, but I will hand over all the clients, employees, and suppliers. All you have to do is run it and continue supporting the orphanage." He even had a stack of documents ready, urging the senior, "Don't spend too long worrying. There isn't much time." The senior asked an acquaintance in the auction and real estate business to review the documents, and on the surface, it was evaluated as having excellent sales, profitability, and conditions. The money was the issue, but the man even provided a solution, saying, "Just sign the contract first, and then take out a secured loan using the factory's land and equipment to pay for it." Excited and feeling that he might actually become a president, the senior's spirits rose, and he even started visiting banks and began to see a clear path to getting the loan approved. Then, one day, a representative from the capital company came to the dealership office and confronted the senior, saying, "There is an abnormally high number of cases among the cars you've sold over the past year where the debt has not been recovered." When he looked at the list, almost all of the purchasers who had bought their cars through that man were in arrears, with payments having stopped completely, with only one exception. Furthermore, when he pulled the vehicle registration records, he discovered that within less than a month of being delivered, the cars had been sold off one after another to used car dealers across the country. Since there were no liens on the vehicles, it had been incredibly easy to sell them off. When the senior called the man flew into a rage, retorting, "My nephews are driving them properly. Are you doubting me?" He even blamed the senior for talking about the situation to others. However, the capital company had no reason to lie, and when the senior confirmed with used car dealers, the description of the person who had brought the cars in perfectly matched that of the man. The senior then became convinced that the man had been lying from the very beginning. Yet, at the time, he rationalized it by telling himself, "As long as I successfully take over the factory, it will be fine," and chose not to dig any deeper. However, the situation did not end there. The capital company, concluding that the contact information, addresses, and workplaces of all the defaulters appeared to be fraudulent, visited the locations only to find no trace of them. They eventually reported the case to the police as a possible loan fraud scheme. From that point on, the man's cell phone remained powered off and unreachable. A few days later, the senior was also questioned by the police and told them everything he knew. The police stated, "We won't go into the details of the Credit Business Act for now, but we don't see any evidence of you being an accomplice in this loan fraud scheme," and the investigation continued. Furthermore, according to what the senior heard from a police acquaintance, the face of the man captured on the dealership's CCTV did not match the face of the person registered as the actual owner of the brick factory. In other words, the man had likely been impersonating the factory owner the entire time. Unable to bear the anxiety any longer, the senior went to the mansion at night, only to find it in complete disarray, as if someone had hurriedly packed their bags and fled. Furthermore, the moment he turned to head toward the factory, the shaman's words, "The factory is a hellhole," pierced through his mind, and goosebumps broke out all over his body. The senior visited the shaman once more, and she agreed to accompany him, saying, "I will go to the factory with you just this once." However, as they approached it, she screamed, "Turn back," and only after they were at a distance did she say, "People are lying down near the piles of bricks." Since the senior was also in a position where he could be suspected, he asked the police to go and check the factory with me, and he went through the facility with the officers. On the surface, there was nothing but bricks and equipment, and no conclusive evidence was found. However, the moment the senior looked at the structure of the kiln, he felt strangely unsettled by the several square holes inside it, and he had an intuition that, if a person were to lie down in there, it would be a perfect fit. He then asked the police if bone components were mixed into the bricks or dust, would they show up in a chemical analysis? The police, though half skeptical, collected samples of the bricks and dust and sent them for forensic analysis. A few days later, through a different line of investigation, the man was identified via fingerprints and apprehended, but he insisted on saying nothing but, "I know nothing." When the police tracked the histories of the missing persons, all of their original addresses traced back to the same orphanage. Furthermore, it was revealed that the man had held a position at that facility in the past and had a criminal record of being sentenced to 2 years in prison for embezzling support funds, after which he was expelled. Ironically, the man had treated the children well, and many of them reportedly trusted him and followed him as if he were a father figure. When the results of the analysis came back, bone components were detected in the bricks and dust, but it could not be determined whether they were human or animal. The police conducted a thorough search of the entire factory area, but not even a single strand of hair was found, and no traces of any bodies were discovered. What made it even more inexplicable was that the actual owner of the brick factory had also gone missing. What sent chills down the senior's spine as he looked back on it later was the second floor of that mansion. According to the police investigation, there was an operating room-like space on the second floor, and the brick factory was less than a 3-minute drive from the mansion. Therefore, even without concrete proof, the senior couldn't help but imagine the worst-case scenario. If you dispose of people, crush their bones into dust, and turn them into bricks, they will never be found. In the end, the charges that could be brought against the man were limited to what could be proven: financial fraud, various irregularities, and medical equipment violations, resulting in a 3-year prison sentence. And what was most terrifying of all was the thought that such a man might be living his life normally somewhere, right at this very moment. The local newspaper covered it as a mere short article about a fraudster who posed as a businessman. But for the senior, it was not a story that could be summed up in a brief snippet. It is said that if the shaman hadn't told him, the spirits inside the bricks were wailing, the senior would never have thought to request a chemical analysis of the bricks. Incidentally, the shaman reportedly laughed later, saying, "My spiritual vision has faded, so now I just read from books to give readings." But the senior could not bring himself to laugh. Having heard the entire story, the only conclusion left in my heart was that humans are thousands of times more terrifying than ghosts. And although we exchanged some jokes at the very end, even those jokes could not wash away the lingering, heart-chilling aftertaste of the story.